Hi, my name is Andre Gonawela. Welcome to this week's edition of the Burn Bag Podcast. I'm delighted to be joined by Uri Bar-Joseph. He is a professor emeritus in the Department for International Relations of the School for Political Science at Haifa University in Israel. He is the author of The Watchman Fell Asleep, The Surprise of Yom Kippur and Its Sources, and with Rose McDermott, Intelligence, Success, and Failure, The Human Factor. And he has a new book out in Hebrew called Beyond the Iron Wall. There's an English version of that book in the works, but it sort of dissects the intelligence failures around the October 7th attacks committed by Hamas into Israel, and sort of some of his critiques of the Israeli sort of security lifestyle that we'll get into in this conversation. But this convo is going to, dive into some of those failures around October 7th, what sort of went on, and the historical context that we find ourselves in with regards to Israel's broader position in the Middle East and the current ongoing war in Gaza. But Uri, thanks so much for joining me here today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So Yuri, before we sort of dive into, the history of intelligence failures in Israel, the Yom Kippur War, which you're a deep expert on, and the October 7th attacks, I sort of want to touch on a piece that happened in the news this week, the pager attacks in Lebanon that were targeting Hezbollah operatives. Israel, I don't think, has necessarily taken official credit for those attacks, but I just wanted to sort of ask you, what were your thoughts about that?
Well, there are two aspects to this operation. First, operationally, it is a brilliant operation. It is a very large scale. Nothing has been done like this. Targeting operation, targeting killing against the enemies of Israel, and hardly any civilians or non-involved persons were harmed by these attacks, and which is by far better than the bombing, for example, in Gaza, where many civilians were killed in the attempts to kill Hamas guerrillas or terrorists. And in this sense, I think that it is a new stage in history of warfare. You don't use the technology in order to kill one person, but you use it in order to destroy or harm the operational capabilities of a very significant enemy by destroying its chain of command, destroying its communication sets, etc. And it was carried out and prepared brilliantly. So this is from the operational point of view. From the strategic or political point of view, in many respects, it is a big waste because it is a surprise attack that nothing comes after it. And now Israel waits for Hezbollah's reaction. And it is obvious that Israel doesn't want to escalate the war into an all-out war, but to carry out such an operation and to avoid a major offensive after that, when the enemy had been weakened so much, is a waste of a golden opportunity. Now, don't misunderstand me. I don't want Israel to go into a large war with Hezbollah. It will be very difficult and harmful to Israel as well. But from the strategic point of view, it is a waste of a golden opportunity.
No, so that's really interesting because I think when I heard about this news, we have about 3,000 injured, I believe, from these attacks, some dead, and just a few civilians dead, which is a tragedy, of course. But what struck me about this was the precision of the attack, the fact that these are generally pagers that would be owned by Hezbollah operatives. But, you talk about this as sort of like a quote, like sort of a golden opportunity, but a waste at the same time. And I mean, with Israel's actions and reactions towards Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, what do you think the Israeli strategy is with regards to Hezbollah? Are they trying to preempt, a war? Are they trying to react to, potential Hezbollah strikes in advance? Or are they trying to sort of neutralize the threat? Or, as some critics would say, are they trying to sort of ignite another northern war?
I think that the term strategy in the context of this war is somewhat, how should I put it, misleading. I don't think that Israel has any strategy in this war. The only goal, as it was defined by Prime Minister Netanyahu, was to achieve a total victory against Hamas, which is a very vague and unclear goal, and that's about it. And we see it in the Israeli military activity and now intelligence or covert operations activities. On the one hand, you see the IDF performing okay in occupying Gaza, destroying much of Hamas power. But after almost a year after the war started, Hamas is still active in Gaza. The war doesn't seem to be getting close to its end, and there is no solution and no viable activity to replace the Hamas rule in Gaza. It's obvious that Israel doesn't want Hamas to rule Gaza, but it doesn't act in any way to build up an alternative rule to Hamas rule, because an alternative rule means the Palestinian Authority. And Netanyahu and his coalition, his right-wing coalition, know that once the Palestinian Authority will become more an active actor in this war, this will revive the demand for negotiations and the buildup of a Palestinian state. And for Netanyahu, and especially for his right-wing, extreme right-wing coalition members, a Palestinian state is a nightmare. So they avoid any discussion of a political end to the war. And once you don't have any political end to the war, there is no end to the war. And in this sense, there is no strategy. The same is true with regard to Hezbollah, because Hezbollah says again and again and again, Nasrallah speaks about it again and again, that he will not end the war in northern Israel as long as the war in Gaza continues. This means that if you don't end the war in Gaza, the war in Lebanon will continue and escalate, and no one knows why, apart from the fact that Netanyahu promised to achieve a total victory, and no one knows what a total victory is. This is a horrible way of running a war, and there is no strategy.
So taking a step back, I do want to dive into, a lot of your analysis on this and your perspectives. But taking a step back to now, October 7th, we're about to hit the 1 year mark of this. Sort of a two-pronged question. Why did October 7th happen? One, in terms of why did Hamas feel compelled to launch this large-scale attack, knowing very much, that I feel like they would know that this type of war would be upon them with just this massive sort of scale of destruction. But why was the Israeli security apparatus caught so off guard? Why was it a perfect failure in many ways?
We don't know for sure what was the Hamas strategy. We don't know about the internal discussions, the agreements, disagreements with regard to Hamas. We know that the attack took place. Hamas perceived itself, or still perceive itself, as the leader of the Palestine in both the West Bank and Gaza, and in the future between the river and the sea, that is all of the territory of Israel and the Palestinian territories. And the attack was probably aimed at um, demonstrating the Hamas capabilities and defeating the Palestinian Authority, which still rules the West Bank, and let the Hamas take over the West Bank as well. The timing of the attack was influenced by various factors. Probably one of them was the negotiations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which on the eve of the attack seemed to be ripe to that an agreement, normalization agreement between the two states was in the making. And for the Hamas to accept that Saudi Arabia, that the defender of the holy places in Mecca and Medina, will accept that Israel is the occupies East Jerusalem with the Al-Aqsa, the third most holy place for Islam, is under Israeli occupation, and Saudi Arabia accepts it. This was what probably triggered Hamas to carry out the attack in October. And the main question is indeed not why Hamas attacked, but why Israel was caught surprised, so surprised by this attack. And here I'll say just two things. There were two conceptions. And in intelligence, as anyone who works in intelligence knows, you cannot work without conceptions. One conception was that the Hamas is deterred. The Hamas knows that it doesn't have the capabilities. The Hamas knows that Israel will react very strongly to any major scale, large scale attack, and therefore the Hamas is deterred. The other conception was that Israel will know if Hamas wants to attack. We have excellent means of collection in Gaza, mainly technological means. We knew very intimately what Hamas is doing, its leaders were doing, were thinking, were writing, whatever it is. We don't know yet the details of this collection capabilities, but we know that we had everyone agrees that we had excellent means of collection. And for one reason or another, this means of collection didn't provide the warning prior to the attack. And Israel relied, or the Israeli intelligence system relied too much on technology, insufficiently on human sources and other more primitive means of collection. And the result was the perfect failure.
What did Israeli security officials and even politicians, what did they thought of, previously to this as the worst case scenario, vis-a-vis a potential attack by Hamas?
The scenario that they had in mind was a Hamas attack on one Israeli kibbutz, community or settlement, maybe two, maybe an attempt to hijack a group of soldiers, something like this. But an all-out attack on such large scale was not on the. They didn't see it coming, and it's quite strange that they didn't see it coming, because we know today that through this wonderful means of collection, we received the Hamas operational plan of this attack. We had it, but for one reason or another, no one thought about it, no one regarded it, and the Israeli military didn't prepare itself for an all-out attack.
So, how do you frame the October 7th attacks in the larger context of Israeli history? I know you're a really great historian on a lot of the failures around the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And at that point, 1973 was one of, the more traumatizing events, in Israeli history, in a modern political sense, in a modern military sense. How do you sort of compare the two?
Well, the October 7th attack took place precisely 50 years and a day after the surprise attack of the Yom Kippur War. And until the morning of October 7th, the Yom Kippur attack was the most traumatic event in Israeli history. And of course, now it was replaced by the October 7th attack, which is by far a far larger intelligence failure. Um, in 73, we had good collection. There were many warning indicators. The political leadership of Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan, they were ready to accept that Egypt and Syria are going to attack for one reason or another, and I won't get into it now. Military intelligence, which in 1973 was Israel's sole intelligence estimator, national estimator, declined to provide a warning until the very last moment. Nevertheless, about 36 hours before the war started, the IDF chief of staff decided that there are enough warning signals to take the whole regular Israeli forces and send them to the borders. And in fact, when the war started on October 6th at 2 o'clock, all the Israeli regular forces, five brigade, armor brigade, tank brigades were in the border, and the mobilization of the reserve army has started. And this was what prevented Israel from a total collapse in the first day or two of the war. On October 7th, it is not that they didn't mobilize anyone. It is also that the soldiers who were to keep the border, who were deployed on the border, they were caught in their beds by the Hamas terrorists. They were shot down in their beds, which shows you the level of surprise and lack of preparedness in October 7th. It is by far worse than 1973. And until now, we don't understand what happened.
So, in reading a little bit of your book, or actually taking a look at some of the materials you had sent me before this, you mentioned Israel's security lifestyle. And I sort of noticed that you make a really interesting analogy of, Israel's security lifestyle, as you say, to that of someone born with quote unquote problematic genes. Could you explain what the security lifestyle is and, what that analogy means?
Yes, yes. Israel, as you know, is a Western type democracy in the Middle East, which is, I would say, not the regimes, the Arab regimes in the Middle East are not so democratic. There is a different, it is a very different culture, and most of all, the Israeli buildup of, I mean, the Zionist movement started to build the what became later as the State of Israel towards the end of the 19th century in an environment, in a region where everyone was hostile to the idea of a Jewish state in the midst of Arab Middle East. And of course, there was and there still is the Palestinian problem. So Israel lives by, let me put it this way, the Israeli genetics are very different from the genetics of Switzerland, for example, which is surrounded by friendly nations. And therefore, Israel genes is not the best in the world. The Israelis, we like to speak about ourselves as a villa in the jungle. You want to maintain the lifestyle of a villa, but you are surrounded, you live in a jungle and you have to be prepared all the time and ready to war. Now, in order to, we know that a person whose genetics is not perfect, or any person who wants to be healthy, um, he has to do two things. One is to make sure that he has all the facilities like a good physician, a good health insurance, the hope that a good hospital, etc., etc., anything that is needed to help him in case of a medical problem. And the analogy to Israel's security or to the security world is that if you face security problem, you must have a good army, you must have good intelligence services, you must have a good air force, etc., etc. This is one thing, but we know that if you want to be healthy, it's not enough that you have good health insurance. You also must live in a healthy lifestyle. And what is healthy lifestyle? No smoking, doing gym, sport, eat good nutrition, etc., etc. And in the Israeli case, we have excellent health insurance, but we live a very, very unhealthy way of life, which means that we don't try to meet the challenges to Israel's security by political and diplomatic means. We smoke, we eat a lot of red meat, we don't do sport, we count only on our health insurance or on our military intelligence, etc., the security apparatus. And October 7th proves that this is not enough. And the way to deal with Israel's security challenges involves diplomatic and political means to diminish the threats to Israel. This means that Israel has to start negotiations with the Arab world, and Israel has to start negotiations with the Palestinians, because the Palestinian issue is the source of Israel's security problems in many respects. There is one solution to the Palestinian issue, and this is a two-state solution, a Palestinian state. Everyone agrees to that, except the current Israeli leadership, who is not ready to speak about such a solution. And we saw the policy of Benjamin Netanyahu since he came to power, returned to power in 2009. He did everything he could to turn off the possibility of negotiations towards a two-state solution. The negotiations should be carried out not with Hamas, but with the Palestinian Authority. Hamas doesn't recognize Israel. Hamas declared that it wants to destroy the Jewish state, so you cannot negotiate with Hamas. And nevertheless, Netanyahu, because he is against a two-state solution, he cultivated Hamas for 15 years, and we saw the result on October 7th.
So, I have a bunch of follow-ups from that. But say, if I'm a critic or if I'm say like, one of the US foreign policy advocates for Israel, for example, like those in the, some Republican administrations, even those in the Clinton administration, many in the US and Israel, may blame the Palestinians for torpedoing like the Oslo Accords during the 1990s. And, as you just said, right? You said that Israel in general has been more adverse to political resolutions on the return of those territories occupied after the Six-Day War in 67. So, how do you respond to those critics who will point to Oslo, who will point to, Ehud Olmer's, 2008 peace plan, or even, Israel's willingness to negotiate with Egypt in Camp David, during the late 1970s, because they'll say, okay, Israel's willing to negotiate. You say, they're more adverse to political resolution. So how do you sort of merge that together and address that?
Well, you need to for dancing the tango, and of course, the Palestinians are not always the most convenient partners to negotiations, but if it was an easy problem to solve, we probably had a solution long time ago. It is a difficult situation, but if you look at Oslo, Oslo ended in many respects on the day that Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister who led Oslo, was assassinated by an Israeli right-winger. This was the beginning of the end of the Oslo process. And it was not because of the Palestinians, it was because of the Israeli right-wing opposition to Oslo. If you look at Ehud Olmert, you mentioned Ehud Olmert, he came very, very close to achieving an agreement with Abu Mazen, but Olmert ended his tenure as prime minister because of domestic issues and not because of the negotiations with the Palestinians. And this was 2008. Since 2009, we have Benjamin Netanyahu, and since then, there are no negotiations with the Palestinians, with the Palestinian Authority. Nevertheless, everyone, including Netanyahu himself, admit that when it comes to security issues, the Palestinian Authority cooperates with Israel, with the Israeli security services, to prevent any terrorist acts in the West Bank. So you see that in some respects, you can count on the Palestinian Authority. The problem is not so much terrorism, the problem is more ideological. On the one hand, Israel under Netanyahu does whatever it can to diminish the power of the Palestinian Authority, and its power is diminished, and it is very unpopular for various reasons, not only because of the Israelis. And at the same time, Netanyahu's government continues building up settlements in the West Bank in order to prevent any viable partition of the West Bank between Israel and the Palestinians. The territory in which a Palestinian state should be established is the West Bank, and building the settlements there is an attempt to prevent it. That's it.
No, yeah, and certainly, I want to touch on the settlements because, a lot of critics of Israel will say Israel's enforcing an apartheid, regime in the West Bank. I think one of the more interesting people who've said that is Tamir Pardo, who is the former Mossad chief who said this. And, I had an interview with former Director of National Intelligence Jim Clapper, who said, when I asked him about the two-state solution, he said, he had doubts that a two-state solution could even happen because the second state, the Palestinian state, the territory in the West Bank is sort of receding and receding with those settlements. And I mean, Yuri, what is the rationale behind the settlements? What's sort of the political rationale that, the more right-wing elements will put up But then, what is that more practical rationale that, you sort of just outlined right now around that?
Well, again, just like just as with the word of strategy with regard to this war that we currently have, rationale is a difficult word when it comes to the settlements, because what the settlers and the right wingers want is an Israeli state or a Jewish state between the river, the Jordan River, and the sea, the Mediterranean. It is a territory of about 30,000 square kilometers. And in this territory, between the river and the sea, we have now about 7 million Jews and 7 million non-Jews, mostly Muslims, Arabs. So the when you come to you look at this demography, you understand that if there is one state, it won't be a Jewish state. It cannot be a Jewish state where half of the population is non-Jewish. And I understand why Tamir Pardo, for example, speaks about an apartheid state, because if there is such a state, and it will be ruled by the Jews, probably the Muslims will be second level citizens, just like in South Africa. So maybe Jews and Arabs will be able to go together in a bus. It won't be an apartheid like this, but the Palestinian Arabs, the inhabitants of the West Bank and Gaza, will not have the same civil rights that Jews have or citizens of Israel has, and I don't see the solution here. We know that South Africa was a very unique case, and at the end, apartheid collapsed. I don't see the rationale when you ask the right wingers about what's the rationale, what will be at the end. They speak in terms of God will help us, or something like this. And when you start involving God in politics, you are in a very difficult problem.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And now sort of turning to, the war in Gaza, I feel like one of my hot takes is that I feel like Hamas is effectively winning the war in Gaza, not in a military sense, but in a political sense. I mean, you talked earlier about, we can't necessarily negotiate with Hamas on the two-state solution because they don't believe in the existence of Israel. But, there are negotiations ongoing with Hamas, about the hostages, about the potential ceasefire, and so on. Israel has sort of been isolated in a diplomatic sense. I don't really see how any future, democratic administration in the United States would have as easy a time supporting Israel in the unequivocal way that the US has supported Israel in the past. And, you have these, international criminal court prosecutions around like genocide. And it just feels like Israel's being more and more diplomatically isolated. And I mean, for Hamas, like, I feel like there's more of an Islamic radical extremist group, their sort of ideology is more apocalyptic. They're not sort of necessarily, at least in my view, there is more of an apocalyptic take towards, their ideology. So, I mean, what's your take on that? Am I wrong? Are they not winning the war in a political sense, or are they, more successful in navigating this war than one would have envisioned or the Israeli government would see?
Well, first of all, you're not wrong, and I think that everything you said is well, it's reality. Um, the only thing that the only missing link in this situation that we didn't discuss so far is the personal future of Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu faces a trial It is going now for 3 years or so. It is delayed, but in early December, Netanyahu was supposed to come to the witness stand and give his testimony. And all experts agree that he's going to lose this trial and probably end in jail. Now, for Netanyahu, the best situation is an ongoing war, which will last forever if he can get it, because this will delay the ending of his tenure as a prime minister. And if you want to understand the Israeli strategy in this war, diplomatic, political, and military, you cannot understand it without combining the parochial interests of Netanyahu. And for the time being, Israel's strategy is led by these parochial interests. It is not Israel's national security. Is not the war is about Netanyahu's personal security, and it is not me, a professor in the university, who said it. I never voted for Netanyahu, but I never thought that something like this could have happened to Israel. We're talking about generals in the army who speak about this war as a war of Netanyahu, not a war of Israel. We, for the time being, he has in Israel, it is a parliamentary political system. So as long as the prime minister has a majority in the parliament, in the Israeli Knesset, he will not fall. And he has 64 members of parliament, and none of them is ready to do something about it. So he enjoys a very stable coalition. And as long as this is the case, the war will not end. There will be no hostages deal. There will be no political solution to the war in Gaza, and the war with Hezbollah might escalate to an all-out war that will include bombing Tel Aviv and Israeli rear, and probably an all-out war in the Middle East. And it is all because I know it sounds strange. It cannot be. It's absurd. But most Israelis agree that this is because Netanyahu is not ready to end the war. Because it will end he's afraid that it will end his tenure as prime minister and put him in jail.
And you know what's interesting about Netanyahu, and I feel like a lot of younger listeners may not understand this, but I mean, there's something to be said about the longevity of Netanyahu's political career. Like, yes, he's been prime minister since '09, with sort of that 1 or 2 year gap in between. But he was also prime minister in 1996 through 1999. You earlier mentioned the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. You sort of mentioned, how, certain politicians have brought in God about this. I think before the assassination of Rabin, Netanyahu himself, who was also then the Likud leader, had accused the government of being, quote, removed from Jewish tradition and Jewish values with regards to, I believe the Oslo Accords and those negotiations that were ongoing. So, I mean, while there is surprise about, how the IDF generals are sort of saying that this is Netanyahu's war, maybe not a war for Israel, is, Netanyahu today, in 2024, under these criminal investigations, is this almost sort of like a classic Netanyahu? Is like, would you have expected the Netanyahu of 1996 to navigate this situation in a very similar way? Or is this a different Netanyahu in 2024 from when he was first prime minister in 96, 97?
Well, when Netanyahu, he's not, unlike most other Israeli leaders, he left Israel. He spent quite a lot of time in the United States, studying there, making a career there. And he returned to Israel only after his brother Jonathan Netanyahu was killed in the Entebbe raid that was carried out in 1976. And Netanyahu became a very famous name in Israel after his brother was killed, and this was the beginning of Bibi's, let's call him Bibi, Bibi's political career. This was the launching pad for his political career, and I think that he was a different type of leaders in the Likud when he started to become a star, a political star, but nevertheless, a different type of leader, but he was okay. The change in Netanyahu's conduct as a political leader took place probably in 2015. After elections where everyone thought that he's going to lose and he won. And after he won these elections, he decided that he needs to make the Israeli media, to get the Israeli media to support him more because he wasn't too popular in the Israeli media. He has his grassroots support, but what we call Bibists, like you call Trumpists. But the more sophisticated media showed many of his misjudge and failures as a politician, as a leader. And since 2015, everything that Netanyahu does is connected to his personal future. And for the last 5 years, all Israeli politics stand in the shadow of his criminal procedures. And it seems like he's influenced dramatically. We don't even know how much, but this week, for example, in the midst of a war, some say it is a war, the worst war that Israel had ever fought. He wanted to replace the Minister of Defense. Everyone agrees that the Minister of Defense is one of the only one bright light in the conduct of this war. He wanted to replace him with another politician who is not an expert on security issues. Because his wife doesn't like too much the current Minister of Defense, Gallant, Yoav Gallant, but the problem was that his wife Sarah doesn't like too much the one who was supposed to replace the Minister of Defense, Gallant, whose name is Gideon Sa'ar. And until Tuesday afternoon, when the pagers blow-up operation started, everyone was certain that within a few hours, Gideon Sa'ar will replace Gallant, to a large extent because Sarah Netanyahu, the wife of Netanyahu, doesn't like Gallant, doesn't trust him. We were lucky because she doesn't trust Sa'ar as well. So it was avoided. But the influence of Sarah Netanyahu and Netanyahu's son Yair is tremendous, and we try to think about Israeli politics, about Israeli strategy, about the war in terms of professional, in a professional way. What does Israel try to achieve? What is the strategy of the IDF? Things like that. But at the end, it comes to psychological issues. What does Sarah Netanyahu believes in, and what does Yair tell his father? And these were rumors. There wasn't enough proof for that until a few months ago. But now the evidence is growing. Netanyahu is a captive, or Netanyahu is not how should I put it? He cannot calculate, he does not calculate the fate of Israel by normal standards. He calculates everything by his own fate and by what Sarah and Yair tell him about what he should do. And I know it sounds crazy, but you had a president um, 4 years ago, until 4 years ago, who was also quite, how should I put it, unorthodox. And Netanyahu is now at least as unorthodox as Trump was during his tenure. And add to this also Yair Netanyahu, his son, and his wife Sarah, who are very unorthodox persons and Trump didn't have it. Netanyahu has them as well. So this is how Israeli strategy is shaped now. I mean, Israeli soldiers are killed, Israeli civilians are killed. There is a threat to the state of Israel, and everyone asks himself, what will Sarah say about it? It's crazy.
So, I mean, when we talk about the strategy or the lack of strategy, I mean, the one big thing that has, turned many against Israel and is the conduct of the war, how the war has been run. I mean, tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians, being killed, I mean, almost every day, we're seeing these images of Palestinian kids with lost limbs and just so many other sort of gruesome injuries and just morbidities. Why is Israel, I guess, why is the IDF sort of conducting the war, with that significant collateral damage, with those mass civilian casualties, the way it is? Is this a political thing, or is this sort of like a lack of care in terms of a military operational sense? What's your take on that?
It's complicated, but first of all, it is the impact of the shock of October 7, the atrocities, rapes, murders of the Hamas, which released many of the limits to Israeli use of power that existed in the past. Israel after October 7th is not the same Israel that was before October 7th, also in this regard. Now, most of the Palestinian casualties in Gaza are casualties of air attacks. We know that Israel dropped MK Israeli airplanes, dropped MK-84 bombs, which are 2,000 pounds bombs in populated areas in Gaza. In the past, Israel would have used no more than 100 pounds or 150 or 200 pounds bombs in order to prevent collateral damage. Now, collateral damage is not an issue. On top of this, there is one issue that is hardly being spoken about. It seems like all the IDF targeting system is run by artificial intelligence.
There was a great article about this I was reading, I think, by an Israeli journalist, maybe some few months ago, actually, on the AI usage and targeting.
Precisely. I remember the article. And the fact is that there was no follow-up to this article. But at least during the beginning of the war, where you had hundreds of targets and you had to carry out hundreds of targeted killings, the IDF wanted to. It was run by AI, not by humans. There was a human touch at the end. There was you needed an officer to give approval to the decision of AI, and sometimes they didn't approve it. But all the process was automatic, and therefore, and in this sense. And you in the past, when the collateral damage could have been to civilians, there were many thoughts before that, whether we should do it or not. Now, automatically, the collateral damage rose to 15. That this means we can bomb a target in order to kill Hamas, I don't know, commander or whatever it is, even if we estimate that 15 civilians are going to be killed. And the calculation was made by AI. The final approval was made by a human officer. But the combination of the shock of October 7th and the introduction of AI into the targeting killings or the bombing operations of the Israeli Air Force is the main explanation. Now, there is one more explanation. What you see on TV screens in the United States or in Europe or in the Arab world, Israelis don't see on their TV screens unless they turn to CNN. The Israeli media hardly touches on what's going on in Gaza. When you have a father who goes to get the birth certificates of his two sons, twins that were born, and when he returns home and he finds out that the mother and the twins were
Absolutely.
killed in an Israeli attack, you remember this incident?
Yep.
It made a lot of noise in all over the world. It made hardly any noise in Israel. And when you ask the Israelis, you ask, not the extreme right wingers, but you ask an average Israeli about Palestinian casualties, they don't see them. They don't understand what's going on in Gaza because the Israeli media, for one reason or another, decided that it is unpopular to see the atrocities that are being done now in Gaza. So the average Israelis are not aware of what's going on in Gaza. The casualties, we know that the numbers, of course, according to Palestinian sources, are about 43,000 killed. By the way, it is the highest number of casualties in any Arab-Israeli war. There was no war where you had so many casualties, of course. Most of them, or at least 25,000 are civilians, non-involved persons. But if you ask the average Israeli, including my friends, about it, they don't give a damn. This is the problem of the Palestinians. This is what they have to pay for the atrocities that Hamas conducted on October 7th.
And folks, the article me and Yuri are referring to was published in Plus 972 magazine. It's titled Lavender, the AI Machine Directing Israel's Bombing Spree in Gaza by Yuval Abraham on April 3rd, 2024. It was published. And Yuri, when I sort of look at the current state of the war, I'm Sri Lankan American. So Sri Lanka had its civil war from 83 to 2009, and I see many similarities with, those echo chambers that you talk about, with how Sri Lankans perceive a lot of the war crimes and a lot of the civilian casualties that occurred at the end of the war and, what actually happened on the ground. So, that's a very interesting point and a very good point you do make. And I mean, in terms of peace negotiations, I feel like peace negotiations, the opportunity for that, the window for it is rapidly closing, And obviously, I don't want to diminish October 7th. October 7th was the most traumatic attack for Jews since the Holocaust because of the mass number of casualties that occurred. But when you're talking about tens of thousands of Palestinians killed, there's just that wide gap, in the numbers. And it's becoming harder and harder, I would say, for just like normal civilians to trust each other. Again, with those media echo chambers you talk about, with your friends in Israel, with, of course, the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, like if you're that Palestinian father, right, and you hear about peace negotiations, you won't necessarily understand the trauma of October 7th. You're going to understand the trauma of your two kids getting killed, your two newborn infants and wife being killed by the Israeli airstrike and so on, right? And like, if you're a kid losing your family, your limbs, you're going to understand that trauma as you should. So, I mean, how can the two sides even build trust with each other with all of this stuff going on with the conduct of the war as it is right now?
Let me just, before I relate to this question, let me just emphasize one point. You mentioned Sri Lanka and, of course, other civil wars or other wars where there are war crimes. We don't have something like this conducted by the Israeli army. It is not that the Israeli army collects civilians and start shooting them. And it doesn't shoot even Hamas terrorists when they raise up their hands. In most cases, but the Palestinian losses are losses, and they are the product of the war itself, not of war crimes conducted after fire ends. So I want to make this point clear. It is not the same type of war crimes. Now, about the future. One of the highly interesting issues in my mind is that there are polls conducted by very serious institution, an academic institution in the Hebrew University called Accord Center. And they don't ask the regular questions of what do you think of Bibi Netanyahu, but they ask also questions about what do you see as a solution? How can we get out of this dire situation where we are now? And when you ask the Israelis, and these questions was repeated during the last 3, 4 months in polls, every month they make a new poll with a very good sample of the population, Israeli population. About a third agrees to a solution of Palestinian state, demilitarized Palestinian state as part of an ending of the Arab-Israeli conflict, a recognition of Arab states in the state of Israel, diplomatic relation, economic relation, normalization of relations between the Arab states and Israel, and all this with American and European support. About a third supports this solution. About a third of the sample is not against this solution. They don't like it too much, but they have no objection to such a solution. Now you look at it, and about 60-something% of the Israelis accept in reality, they accept the Arab League peace proposal of 2002, what started as the Saudi peace proposal, which is still valid today. There were polls in Gaza during the war. I don't know exactly the results. They were conducted by Halid Kaki, who is the most important Palestinian poller for many years. And they showed that more than 50% of the Palestinians in Gaza support a political solution, which will recognize the state of Israel in its 1967 borders. And it shows you that despite everything that happened, despite the natural hatred between the two people, there is a room for a political solution. What we need is a leadership. Now, you have to remember that in 1945, Second World War ended, And we found out about the Holocaust that took place in Europe. And almost all European Jews were killed by the Nazis during the war. 8 years later, Israel and the West Republic of Germany signed a sort of a normalization agreement, not diplomatic relations yet, but the German Federation or the German government admitted in the crimes it conducted and agreed to support Israel economically. And Israeli and German diplomats shook hands and met. And so if 8 years after the Holocaust we could do it, I'm sure that we can do it also with the Palestinians. And I think that the polls, both by Shkaki and by the Accord Institute, show that there is a popular support for a political solution, and what you need is strong leadership in Israel and a more effective government, Palestinian Authority in the Palestinian side in order to start moving this direction.
On that note, Yuri, thank you so much for joining me here today. I really appreciate this conversation. It was very interesting. A lot of interesting perspectives you raised. And again, the book is called Beyond the Iron Wall. It's only out in Hebrew right now, but it will be out in English, I think, in some time. But Yuri, thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.